A warm welcome and a warm welcome to Kathie. Kathie and I had intended having this presentation in a different shape, in a bus going around Mount Pleasant, but as you all know, this had to change. So now we have a virtual tour, which I'm sure will be much enjoyed. Just a little bit about Kathie. She retired to Hermanus in 2016 after close on 40 years, balancing motherhood and a career in academia in clinical medicine at the Red Cross War Memorial Children's Hospital. She joined our committee fairly recently, the History Society Committee, but she was involved with the two tapestries that we've had in Shrillithla and Mount Pleasant, and the one that you're going to see today. She was very much work done by Kathie Buley. She's also a volunteer at Whale Coast Conservation. So without much ado, I welcome you, Kathie, and I'm delighted to have you present this at last.
Thank you. I first of all just want to say thanks to Gert and Robin and Angela for setting this all up. And I want to welcome and thank all of those attending. I have always wished for a magic carpet to enable me to visit my children and grandchildren, and well, to me Zoom is like a magic carpet of sorts, and so I welcome you all aboard and I hope you enjoy the ride. Just in the interests of good research practice, I just have a couple of disclaimers. I declare no conflict of interests. Verbal informed consent was obtained to use the material from the memoirs and also to take photographs. The timelines presented are not cast in stone. The source of the timeline was from the elders who told us their stories, and a story is always true to the teller. The terminology used is from the vernacular at that time, and it may not be politically correct now, but I'm using it as the stories were told and as how things were expressed. And also just to mention that all the diaries of these people have been archived. Okay, so just an overview. I'll just give you a background to the tour. We're then going to visit Upper Mount Pleasant and a few historical sites. We're going to have some reflections on Skillpook. Then we're going to move to Lower Mount Pleasant and take a look at the cemetery and the Vaspakis. We're going to go into central Lower Mount Pleasant just to get the gees or the spirit of Mount Pleasant. Then we will visit the Moffatt Hall and finally end at the Lombardy Centre where the tapestry hangs. So the Hermanus History Society would like to document a history by the people for the people of the whole of the Overstrand area. There's been very little recorded history of Mount Pleasant, but a rich history exists, and a starting point to create awareness of this often invisible segment of our society was the creation of a tapestry. The tapestry captured the stories and it hangs in Lombardy Centre, but we really wanted to share these stories with more people because it really is a very rich history. So before COVID, we planned a tour to share the gees of Mount Pleasant by enjoying a ride on the Chilbury bus. But of course that couldn't happen, so we've created this virtual tour. So Mount Pleasant, the name of Mount Pleasant is because it is the mountain with a pleasant view. Here is a Google map, and you can see we're going to travel along the R43. We're going to turn up Rotary Way and go up into Upper Mount Pleasant. Then we will cross the R43, go to visit the cemetery, then get into Lower Mount Pleasant proper, go to the Moffatt Hall, and finally end up at the Lombardy Centre. So Upper Mount Pleasant, in 1929, it was decided to establish a coloured fishing community on the mountain side of the road into Hermanus. There had been some black African labourers at De Mont, and in 1937 they were moved into what was called the Bantu Housing Scheme, which was very close to the original cottages up in Upper Mount Pleasant. Then in 1950, there was the Group Areas Act, and any coloured folk who'd still been living in Hermanus sort of proper, they were moved to Mount Pleasant in the 50s and 60s. That was the start of what they called the Plaat en Plankehuise in Lower Mount Pleasant. There had originally apparently been a plan to move all the coloured folk to Horston to create a coloured residential area for the whole region, but this was never achieved. And in the 1950s, the people could walk to the sea in Skillpook from Mount Pleasant. Of course, because of the Separate Amenities Act, the people living in Mount Pleasant couldn't go to Grotto Beach or De Mont, or they could go to Nanny's Beach if they were a nanny, but otherwise they were not allowed to go to any of the beaches. In the 60s, the labourers who lived in the Bantu housing scheme, they had got their families to come and join them, and it became pretty overcrowded there. So these families were then moved to what has become known as Zwelichle. So here you can see that the R43 divides Mount Pleasant into Upper Mount Pleasant and Lower Mount Pleasant. And you'll notice all the names of the streets of flowers. And for me, the language of flowers is far preferable to the language of politicians. So we're going to turn up Rotary Way. We're going to go into a little street called Kathie Street, which is the Afrikaans for gardenia. And we're also going to go into Hibiscus Street and into Hayder Street. So the choice of the flowers for the street names, apparently there was a competition in the 60s. Jenny Sauls was at school then, and with her suggestion of using the names of flowers, she actually was a prize winner, and her prize was 2 litres of Coke. So we're going into Hibiscus Street, and in 1929, 4 houses were built to house the fishing community. These houses had 3 rooms, but they sometimes housed up to 17 people. People put wooden houses in their backyards to accommodate the overflow, and all the ablution facilities were outside, and there was no electricity. So here we have 2 of the original Rooidakies. In the top picture, this house belongs to the Swartz brothers, and their grandfather was one of the original owners of a Rooidaki house. And you can see it's in Hibiscus Street, and you can see in front of the house there is a hibiscus plant. Then the lower picture is also one of the original Rooidakis. You can see it's got a very smart green wall and also a tiled front. And apparently in 2002, there was something called Operation Preen, which was a community effort by the Hermanus Times and sponsors to smarten up Mount Pleasant. So now we're going to move from Hibiscus Street into Hayder Street. And here we're going to stop and look at what was originally the primary healthcare clinic. And you can see there, it's called the Chrissy Dreyer building. So now the medical facilities in the early days of Mount Pleasant, there was 1 nurse who delivered babies and attended to the sick and needy. And as all the elders said, there was no electricity, so die babes moet maar in die kerslig gevang word of olielampies. And a district nurse of note was Chrissy Dreyer, and she lived in a house behind the clinic, which you saw in the previous slide. The clinic is now part of the traffic department and is called the Chrissy Dreyer building. The locals wanted a hospice, but the municipality thought otherwise. For the pedantic people in the audience, the 2 different spellings of Chrissy, the preferred one is with the IE, but when they turned the clinic into the Chrissy Dreyer building, for some reason they used the Y. So the Chrissy Dreyer was the only source of primary health care. She was in contact with Dr. Bester, who was a district surgeon when needed. If people needed to go to hospital, they would go to Caledon, and they had to go in taxis or private transport. There was no ambulance service. But today there is a primary healthcare clinic in Swatdam Road and a very good district hospital. Patients are referred to Eben Donges and Worcester for secondary care and Tygerberg for tertiary care. And of course, there is hospital transport available. So if we go into the Chrissy Dreyer building, then we will see up there this big plaque. So Sarah Christina Magdalena Dreyer was really an iconic personality. And as it says at the bottom of the plaque, she retired in 1988 and passed away in 1991. Sarah Christina Magdalena Dreyer was a true servant to her people, as commemorated in the building named after her. Here we have a picture, which is also in the building, and this was supplied by her son, Gavin Benjamin. So Chrissy Dreyer was born in 1924. She passed away when she was 66 years old, and she delivered over 5,000 babies. What is very significant is she was the midwife for the Caledon district, but she was the first nurse of mixed ancestry that was ever appointed, and that was in 1946. She went to deliveries on her bicycle with a nurse's bag in a carrier on the back wheel, and her son was born in the clinic in 1949. So this is the depiction of Chrissy Dreyer in the tapestry. If you look carefully, you can see the white building in the background. It says clinic up above it. You can see Chrissy Dreyer and her bicycle. And if you look over the back wheel, is a little case with a baby inside. And she became well known as sort of the stalk of Mount Pleasant, because she would appear on her bicycle with the suitcase on the back, and then a baby would appear in the house. And so all the children thought that the babies came in the suitcase with Chrissy Dreyer. So then we move from the clinic to the Clip School in Hayder Street. Now, the Clip School was St. Peter's Mission School. It was built in the 1930s up in Upper Mount Pleasant. It's now a library and a creche. The black learners who were living there had to go to a school in St. Patrick's Church in what is now Lower Mount Pleasant, was Williehle. Prior to 1966, there were still some coloured children living at Dumont, and then they went by bus to the school in Mount Pleasant. Then in 1968, a new primary school was built in Lower Mount Pleasant, and it still stands today. If people wanted to go to secondary school, they had to get their own transport and a bus to the Swartberg Secondary School in Caledon. So the people in Mount Pleasant really loved their sport. They played a lot of cricket and were very keen tennis players. And there was a tennis court behind the Clip School, and now it's a playground. They also loved their rugby. In the 1930s, the north side of Upper Mount Pleasant was called the United Team. The south side was called the Young Stars. And Father Hinchcliffe from St. Peter's Church was the coach and the ref. They played in the Caledon League. The rugby field was also near the clinic in the northern part of Mount Pleasant, and the clubs took turns to mark the field and put up the posts. The teams later combined to become the Mount Pleasant team, and their uniform was royal blue with yellow stripes and white shorts. And there also were a lot of keen golfers in Mount Pleasant. So now there is this very special Chrissy Dreyer Golf Day. But what is special about it is, in order to qualify to play in this golf day, you need to have been delivered by Chrissy Dreyer. And here we have a picture of a rugby team from the 1950s. Then we move on to the church, which is on the corner of Hayder Street and Alvane Straat. And this was the United Reformed Church, or the VG Kerk. So there was quite a close relationship between the school and the church. The school was built in the 1930s and the church was built in the late 40s. But before the church was built, the school used to have church services in the evening, and it also hosted a Sunday school. And then once the church had been built and the number of learners had increased, the church doubled up with extra classrooms. So now we're going to stand on the lawns where the church is, and we're going to look out over Skillpook and talk a little bit about holidays. So in Easter and December, because of the Separate Amenities Act, people couldn't go to De Mont and all those other camping places, so everybody congregated at Skillpook. And there was a path from Mount Pleasant to Skillpook where people could go and enjoy the sunshine, swimming, fishing, and all the benefits of nature. But it wasn't only people from here in Mount Pleasant. People came from all over, from Bredasdorp, Caledon, all over. And they brought their tents, and they also built little boshuisies with shelters under the milkwood trees. And one participant took a newborn baby there. We'll talk about that a bit later. They constructed seating and fireplaces. The Moffatt Hall wasn't too far from there, and they had dances at the Moffatt Hall. And it really was people have very happy memories. And then there was a winkel called the 8-cake winkel where people would do their shopping before going camping. So here we have the tapestry depiction of the 4 rooi duckies. And then you can see the 8-cake winkel where people got all their chips and lekkers. And then you can see the Hoofweg, or the main road, which is separating Upper Mount Pleasant from Lower Mount Pleasant. Little bit more about Skillpook. As I said before, people came camping from afar and people met lifelong partners. There are so many stories about adventures in the times, special times at Skillpook. The camping stopped in 2000. The plan now is to create a better living housing project, or to have serviced plots with electricity, and then people would build their own dwellings. Well, of course, there was a lot of debate going on, and then COVID happened and all the plans are on hold, but it seemed that that area now is just full of serviced plots, so I don't quite know what will happen. This is a picture of Patricia Jacobs with her newborn baby, and she told us very proudly that the umbilical cord was cut and the baby had a long naaldstrom, and she just wrapped the baby up and off she went camping at Skillpook. And it's actually with great sadness that I tell this story, because Patricia Jacobs succumbed to COVID in December last year. Then we're going to leave Upper Mount Pleasant and we're going to cross the R43 and go down into Lower Mount Pleasant. I can imagine that quite a few of you have sat at that pedestrian crossing and perhaps had a moment of irritation while you waited there. But it's a very sad story. In 1979, a child was killed on the R43. There were no health and safety plans at that time, and the Mount Pleasant residents took to the road. They toy-toyed and demonstrated, and ultimately a traffic light and pedestrian crossing was erected. Okay, so Lower Mount Pleasant, at first it was just bush and sand. And as I said earlier, the Black African families who were in the Bantu housing scheme were moved to what became known as Williehle in the 60s. But at that time, the locals called the area Moffatt, because the people kept cows and goats, and there was lots of mooing. More houses were built below the R43 for coloured families in an area that became known as Skillpook. The municipality provided the land and materials, and the people built their own houses, but they had to pay the council R6 per month rental. And also bear in mind that a lot of these people were moved there from other parts of Hermanus with the forced removals. Here are some typical council houses in Lower Mount Pleasant. So our first stop in Lower Mount Pleasant is the cemetery in Alvane Street. There was a cemetery originally for the coloured folk behind Hoy's Koppie, and the people used to carry their coffins from Mount Pleasant to the burial site there. Apparently at some stage the municipality offered the use of an open refuse truck. Then in the early 1950s, there was a decision to extend the white cemetery into the coloured cemetery. And I think the white cemetery had been somewhere near St. Peter's Church. Well, of course, people couldn't be together in life or death, so the coloured bodies all were exhumed and placed in a mass unmarked grave. And this is still a source of great bitterness. And for me, I just think Elsa Gilbert's comment, that's what it does to me when I read something like that. It hits me in the stomach like the kick of a mule, of dignity denied. Then a cemetery was built in Mount Pleasant in the late 1950s, and that's where we will take a look. Here, the thing that strikes you when you go into the cemetery, and even as you drive along the R43, is the headstone and this mass grave. So as I've said before, the people in Mount Pleasant loved their sport. And in the 1970s, of course, that was still the time of apartheid, and people had to make their own arrangements for sport and activities. And there was this awful bus tragedy in June 1972. A rugby match had been planned in Paarl on the Saturday, and a lot of players and spectators went in the bus, and on the way home on the Sunday, for some reason the bus landed in the river, and the driver and all the passengers were killed. This paper clipping was put into the memoirs that one of the people collected. So this was an original paper clipping. And the mass burial site, people were aged from 16 to 42. And I think there were 42 people buried graves in the Mount Pleasant burial site. And I think the other 4 are in Horston. The April family, if you look through that list, lost 4 sons and a daughter, all in one go. It just, for me, it's just excruciatingly painful to think of losing 5 children at one time. Morel de Court, the librarian, she is a surviving sister from the April family. Then we get back onto the carpet or onto the bus, and we go down into Frisia Street, and here we see the mosque. It also doubles up in the daytime as a nursery school or a creche. Then we're going to take a look at this place called the Vaspakis, and I will later talk to the big stone pines, but if you can just see it's now a little park, but you can see the big cement base where the Vaspakis stood. So Annie Klassen, who took Angela and I around Mount Pleasant, she told us all about these Vaspakis. There were no washing facilities in the houses, so the weekly washing was done at the Vaspakis. There was only cold water, and now it's the children's park. On Mondays, the whites were laundered, not the white people, but the white laundry. On Tuesdays, the mixed or bunt wasgoed was done, and then on the Wednesdays, all the whites were re-washed using Reckitt's Blue. And they were scrubbed with the tight small cones from the stone pines that I pointed out in the previous slide. Then all the washing was dried on the lawn and the trees. The washing was done by the young girls, usually those that had left primary school, and then they were taught all the things about washing and looking after the younger siblings. And apparently it was a huge social gathering place. Here we have the tapestry version of the Vaspakis, and this is what the Vaspakis looked like. Okay, so then we're going to drive into Mount Pleasant proper, and I draw your attention to an excellent article which was in the Village News in 2019, written by Elaine Davies and the pictures by Taylor Mayer. The community in Mount Pleasant is just amazingly resourceful. They have an incredible sense of humor, colorful people, community-centered, resilient. It's just has been such a privilege to get to know all these people. The lady on the left is Annie Klassen, who took Angela and I around, was our tour guide when we first went around Mount Pleasant. And then these are various residents that go to Lombardy. Betsy Fitzer on the top on the left-hand side, she wrote these quotes in her diary, which I'll give you a minute to read. So now we'll just take a look at some of the resourcefulness and activities in Mount Pleasant. Here we see an example of resourcefulness with the upcycling in an RDP house. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of a sensory garden, which is one of the non-pharmacological therapies for dementia. And sensory gardens need to be colorful, they need to have depth and height, they need to have flowers which attract birds and insects, and people need to go outside to water the plants so that they can benefit from the blue sky, the sunshine, and the fresh air. So here is a wonderful example of a sensory garden. Here we have another sensory garden. Toka is the most amazing, wonderful character, and her sensory garden is colorful. It's tactile. There are all sorts of things you can touch in it. She's collected recycling, and that forms the borders to the beds. And then it also has something called, what you need in a sensory garden is you need to be reminiscent. And she's got lots of artifacts, which she can tell you all sorts of stories about. So it's a classical example of a sensory garden. Then I just love this sense of humor. We see so many houses with sondela and draw near, but I just love the straightforwardness and directness of Ho Verby. Then we have here a container, so we see the community centeredness of all these people, and here the container is forms as a place for the Association for Persons with Disabilities. Then we move on to St. Patrick's Anglican Church. It was built in 1946 as a war memorial, and it was decided it would be a church and it would also be a school for what was then termed the natives, because they couldn't attend the coloured school or the white schools, but now the school was built for them here at St. Patrick's. In 1969, the school closed. I am imagining that was because of Zwelihle Primary and Lakanya schools, because they had been built in Zwelihle. But when Angela and I went around, it was during the holidays, and there was so much activity in the church with all sorts of holiday clubs and just a lot of happiness and fun and all sorts of things taking place. And apparently in 2016, a new sanctuary was built onto the church. Here is the tapestry version of the St. Patrick's Church. And you can also see in the back, the pinkish building, the Lombardy Centre. And what is quite interesting about this little piece of tapestry is that Angela and I did quite a bit of this section of the tapestry. Then we move on to the Moffatt Hall, and in the background you can see the new primary school. Now, Dr. Henry Alfred Moffatt was really a person of note. He was born in Kuriman, was the great-grandson of Robert Moffatt, the pioneer missionary whose daughter Mary Moffatt married David Livingstone. He was educated at St. Andrew's College in Grahamstown, went to UCT. He trained at Guy's Hospital in surgery and obstetrics. Then he was a medical officer at the Somerset Hospital in Greenpoint, and in the South African War he served in Plumas forces. In World War I he was worked in the medical corps, and in World War II he had been living in Hermanus, but he moved back to and worked at the Wynberg Military Hospital, where he obtained an OBE for his services. These were just quite a lot of articles about him, which came from the Caledon Fenster. He settled in Hermanus in 1933. And as I said, in World War II, he went back to Cape Town. Moffatt Street in Eastcliff is named after him. And he was a humanitarian of note, apparently small stature, but a big heart. And he was principled, compassionate, self-effacing, tolerant, had a good sense of humor and an amazing generosity of spirit. He knew and loved trees, plants, and nature generally. And more specifically, some of the articles in the paper, apparently in January 1933, he fell into the sea at Kwaivata when he was collecting bait. And he was soon discovered by some children floating around unconscious, and they alerted people, and then he was resuscitated by Doctors Bennett and Goldschmidt. He was part of the team that established the Wildflower Reserve. He also had a part in the creation of the Animal Welfare Society. He was on the board of the Non-European Welfare Society, and in 1950 he objected very, very strongly to the forced removal of the coloured people from Lakeview to Mount Pleasant. Then when he passed away, he left £2,000 for welfare work in Mount Pleasant. Well, due to the Group Areas Act, there was just so much dilly-dallying. They didn't know if the coloured people were going to stay in Mount Pleasant or go to Horston or what was going to happen. So it wasn't until 1964, 11 years after his death, that the Moffatt Hall was actually built. Then we move on to the Lombardy Centre. This is where the tapestry hangs, and it was also created here. It's a community centre. It provides midday meals. There's a nursing sister who's in attendance, and the elderly people have outings and enjoy real fun activities. So it's part of SOFTA, and it was created due to the generous donations of Mrs. Lombardy, the wife of the Appetizer King, and also the Hermanus Community Trust. It's a wonderful daily place where elderly people can go. Lots of activities. Jenny Sauls is the manager. And then Mariette Pitlow and Rotia Kleinhans have done knitting projects, knitting jerseys for children at school, and have involved the people in health awareness programs. And of course, all this has gone on hold with COVID. And very sadly, apart from Patricia Jacobs, which I mentioned earlier, there were 3 other people from the Lombardy Centre that have also succumbed to COVID. Here we are in the Lombardy Centre with the completion of the tapestry before it was hung up. Jenny Sauls is the lady in the left in the orange. And next to her is Annie Klassen, who is our guide. And then we have the late Patricia Jacobs. I won't go through all the names of the people, but some people may even recognize themselves there. Here again, we have the people holding out the tapestry when it was completed, before it was mounted in Lombardy. So I just want to say thank you, because we are mindful of the incredibly great privilege which has been afforded to us by the virtue of meeting all the people who have so generously shared their stories and enabled us to create this presentation. Our lives have certainly been enriched. We trust and hope that we have produced a true and acceptable reflection of the life of in Mount Pleasant, and we hope that by sharing with you, we have taken steps towards creating a greater awareness of the living tapestry that makes up all the diverse peoples of Hermanus. And this is just an acknowledgement and of all our sources. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kathie. I wonder whether anyone has any questions or comments that they would like to make at this stage. I would like to ask Kathie if you could say a little more about the origin of the tapestry and why this has proved so successful in enabling people to recall the past and to express their feelings and emotions about events in the past when working on the tapestry. Where did the idea come from and how does it actually work in practice?
Anne Mapham or Angela could talk to this, but basically after all the unrest in Hermanus, a group of us got together and we just sort of felt we needed a better understanding of everybody who lived in Hermanus. So we started off in Zwelichle and we had a meeting where people told their stories, and we also got them to draw pictures. And then from those pictures, the pictures were converted into a tapestry, and we were helped by people from the Transkei, Carol Hofmeyer, and they helped create the tapestry in Zwelichle, and then we did the same thing in Mount Pleasant. And so we got the elderly people to write their stories, and then from the stories, we had a meeting where we all drew pictures, and then from those pictures, the tapestry was created. So we worked with the people at the art workshops, and then also when we created the tapestry. So it was just a lovely medium to all meet together and chat and get to know each other. I don't know if Angela or Anne want to add to something there.
It was very special learning from the Case Karma tapestry, Carol Hofmeyer and her two colleagues, because they had enormous experience, and it was just rather special, but I think she's covered the answer to your question.
Is it possible for people easily to see the tapestry, or do you have to make special arrangements to go to the Lombardy Centre to see it?
Well, it would have been very easy, but of course now with COVID, the Lombardy Centre has been closed for the last 18 months. But as soon as it's open, we would willingly take people or arrange to go and see it, because it is really a very special tapestry.
Regarding the Schliessler tapestry, unfortunately, we have not got a suitable, safe place to hang it. I can show it to people because I have it, but we'd very much like to hang it. It hung in the auditorium at Fine Arts, but we haven't been able to house it in Schliessler as yet.
Any other questions or comments from anyone, please?
Yeah, I was just going to thank you. First of all, Kathie, thank you so much for a most interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. But a question, which river did the bus fall into with the bus tragedy?
It's now part of where Theewaterskloof was.
Yes. But it was the Theewaterskloof River.
I think that's what it was.
That was the river into which the bus went in the evening of a Sunday, late afternoon, early evening of a Sunday. And as Kathie indicated, there were no survivors of that crash, 1972.
I just thank Kathie. This has been so interesting, so warmly presented. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I just want to ask you that the golf day in Kleinmond, if only people who were brought into this world by Chrissy Gray are allowed to play, their numbers surely are now going to be declining. Who's going to, have they thought about what to do with that lovely trophy?
Well, I think the numbers will be declining, but I think what would be lovely is to turn it into an annual event and make it a fundraiser for something special in Mount Pleasant. And yes, and also perhaps one year to host it in Hermanus. It's always been hosted at Kuils River or elsewhere, and I think it would be a great idea to do that in Hermanus and have it as a fundraiser.
Absolutely.
Any other questions or comments anyone would like to make?
Are there any of the children that Christie delivered that have really made a mark, either in Hermanus or somewhere else?
Well, that would be a lovely thing to follow up and to find out. And I'm sure her son, we could have as a springboard just the golf day, and from those people we could find out more about other people.
I'd just like to make a comment. Do you know any more about the Smallberger family? The name was mentioned once. You didn't actually read it out. It was one in the list of names. I know because of the research I'm doing on High Street that Mr. Smallberger in the 1950s was the projectionist at the Adelphi Cinema, which ran between Main Road and High Street. And they lived in an apartment in the building which is now Rossi's Pizzeria. And I know they were moved to Mount Pleasant by the Group Areas Act. Do you know if that's perhaps the same Smallberger family?
Yes, no, I think so, because there was some mention just in passing. I do vaguely remember that, so I think it is the same family. And there are also some other incredible stories, because there were two people who wanted to go on the bus, and one of them, their mother, shouted and said, "You haven't done your homework, you can't go for the weekend, get off the bus and get home." And of course he got home, and it saved his life. So there are a couple of people who missed that awful accident.
Kathie, I've heard the story before about the bitterness about the cemetery. Is there any gesture you think that would be able to somehow bring closure to that pain?
Well, that is something that I think would be great if we could all discuss and see if we couldn't do something, because it just is too horrible.
By the way, just in passing, you were right in saying that you thought that the original cemetery for Hermanus was adjacent to St. Peter's. It was actually roughly where the parking area for the Windsor Hotel from Main Road is now. And the bodies were moved from there to the existing cemetery in the situation in which you outlined in your talk.
And as I understand, that was quite a somber and very respectful affair, whereas the others, the people were just exhumed in the grave unmarked. And yes, I agree with Gert. I think it would be great if we could do something to just acknowledge it and say how sorry.
Shocking story.
Yeah,
shocking. Very heartbreaking.
And probably made even worse, by the fact that in probably what was a well-intentioned gesture by the municipality to make it less onerous for people to carry the coffins from Mount Pleasant to the cemetery at Hoyskopi, offering them the municipal refuse truck to transport their dead.
I just find it all humiliating. It's just awful.
Can I ask another question then? You mentioned in your opening about the research method that all the diaries are archived.
Yes.
Do you think that if the resources could be raised, these could be printed and made available for the public, for people to read? It's well to hear about them, and it's very, very nice to have it in a presentation, but it's not the same thing as actually reading what the individual wrote about his or her experience of the past.
I think that would be a wonderful thing. I think somehow it's a very special material, and I don't know, rather than somebody do an academic study on it, I think if those could be made available, it would be very special.
Well, the people really enjoyed doing it. Do you remember?
Yes, no, they loved it, and the fun and the humor when we chatted to them all, and when Annie Klassen took us on the tour, and as I say, that Talker's Garden, the most amazing people. I feel so enriched having met them.
Thank you very much, Kathie. It was a fun thing to do, and I think you've outlined it beautifully. And it's so nice it'll be turned into a YouTube, so many more people can watch it. You did a great deal of work, and the people loved you dearly. So I thank you very much for that contribution you made to our History Society.